Good afternoon, Derbycon. How's everybody doing today? Right on. Hey, real quick, did everybody go to Oakenfold last night? Paul Oakenfold, and check that out. It was a really good show. Yeah, outstanding. So my name's Tim Wright, and I'm going to be talking about hardware reverse engineering and talking about the HRES process. I'd also like to welcome all of the students at the Louisville Clown College for showing up as well. Really appreciate that. Just so we know, too, there is a group of people in front that will be shooting things at me through my presentation. I was handed a list of words that I am not allowed to say during my talk, and every time I say said word, I'll get shot. So introductions with me. Again, my name's Tim Wright. I am the pen testing team lead at American Electric Power in Columbus, Ohio. And our group currently focuses on pen testing, threat emulation, hardware reverse engineering. I have 20 years of experience in information security, and a lot of that has been the focus of doing vulnerability analysis, pen testing, that type of work. And my Twitter handle is at redteam_hacker. So I'd like to say thank you to the convention for inviting me and letting me present on this today. I've been at every con since the con started, and it's a real honor for me to be here today. And I'd like to say thanks to all the staff for all the work you guys do. You guys really make it a great weekend, and I think it's the best security con out there. So what are we going to talk about today? So today we're going to talk about why reverse engineering of embedded systems and hardware is important for our security programs. Also going to talk a little bit about current state of hardware and embedded security, and why your organization should be looking at these systems and doing this testing. Part of the talk I'm going to be doing is presenting a formalized standard that's online for you to review, and I'm asking for feedback. And a lot of this too is just I'm trying to learn more about doing this type of testing. So a little bit of background first. So embedded device security, is this a new problem? No, it's been there for a long time, and we're seeing more and more organizations having vulnerabilities as a result of embedded systems being deployed. A lot of this, too, is because we're seeing more and more powerful microcontrollers being deployed in embedded devices, so they're having more functionality and a smaller hardware footprint. And as a result, a lot of companies are seeing shadow IT pop up within their organization, where people are going out, buying devices, bringing it into the organization, plugging it into their infrastructures. Some of those devices have wireless, Bluetooth, and so that actually is opening exposure into the infrastructure. So the problem that I'm trying to address is that we don't really have a standard for when we look at doing embedded testing of systems. There's a lot of companies out there that do this. They're offering it as a service, but there's no real defined standard baseline of what we should expect when that is being offered and performed. So if a company comes in and says, hey, I want to test your hardware or your appliance, they can do whatever they want to do, and if we don't really have a good standard, it could just be a vulnerability scan of your system, a port scan, and that could be about it. Where we're saying more firmware analysis probably needs to be done as well. And so that can be very hard when you want to try to scope this assessment. If you've never requested one before and you don't understand what you should be asking for, this is one of the problems we're trying to address. And so what I wanted to show here was that when we look at and think of network pen tests, right? The slide with the network is when you look at a scope of a network pen test, you have Windows machines, Linux boxes, firewalls, multiple subnets. You're going to pivot around, use your PowerShell. Ultimate goal of trying to get elevated writes, find sensitive data on infrastructure, and then write up your report and get those issues remediated. When we think of hardware security or embedded security and doing that type of testing, it's usually a workbench, right? So it's the image on the right. We've got a multimeter, an oscilloscope, logic analyzers, different types of probes. We're going to pull the device apart and actually look at the hardware itself and see how it functions. Now, from that assessment, there could be data that you feed into your pen testing team if you're able to extract LDAP creds or something in the system that is being leveraged for more communications on the infrastructure. So this could be a part of a full scope assessment where you start at hardware and then move into the network side. So hardware security research has been going on for a long time. There's a great blog online, Zipiter does really good work on this. They have a training class that they offer at Black Hat, and I think they have a training facility they do it as well. And then there's a lot of folks who have been talking about this for a lot of years. Daryl gave a talk this weekend on IoT security, talking a lot about this. Dave Kennedy has done a lot of discussions and talks on hardware reversing, and the DEF CON 19 talk was his home automation talk. And then Joe Grand, Travis Goodspeed, Kevin Fenisteer, Stephen Ridley, the list goes on, right? So this is not the first talk on hardware security, and it won't be the last. So one thing I wanted to show with this too is when we think of hardware, and it's not just SOHO devices, we're also looking at SCADA controllers, PLC devices, embedded systems that are within critical infrastructure. And the slide here, the ICS SCADA disclosure, by year, we noticed that it's really low up until around 2010. And then it starts to skyrocket as people start looking at disclosure, start doing testing there. Well, in 2010, Stuxnet happened. And then people started really digging into hardware and embedded systems. So a lot of times it takes an event like that to happen and people start really digging into hardware. And we see some of the disclosures. Again, it's the same types of things we've seen for years. We've got code written in C, buffer overflows. We have a lot of web interfaces. So any of the OWASP vulnerabilities, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, those are just as relevant in these devices, and they can lead to system compromise. So when we think of risk in your organization, some of the things we're talking about, data exfiltration. So if you have any type of intellectual property within this device, or this device allows an adversary to connect into your infrastructure and exfiltrate that data, this could be the result. Also access to the network. If an adversary can use the device to pivot and move into your infrastructure and then gain access to other devices and other systems on your network, this could be a problem. Physical damage. So for legacy systems, especially when we look at ICS and SCADA, it doesn't take very much to knock some of these devices down permanently. So I truthfully believe we need to do more testing in this area with the devices, not only to find the security vulnerabilities, but to make them more resilient to types of attacks. Modification, this could be if you have a device out there monitoring power usage or your billing data, and you have somebody get in and alter that, the company could have a loss of finances, and that could lead to lawsuit and reputational impact as well. And then finally, theft of service. So again, back in the old days of satellite TV where you could modify satellite cards and whatnot, and you could steal satellite TV. This is an example of that. And we still see that going on today. So some of the embedded vulnerabilities that we're looking at, just at a high level, software vulnerabilities, again, buffer overflows, those types of things. Undocumented backdoors in systems. So a lot of times companies, when they build these boards, they'll leave accounts in the firmware. They won't disable them or remove them. And then as you get the firmware and download it and you can actually extract that firmware, you'll find those accounts, and they're usually elevated access accounts. So it could be root or something that has those rights. Physical compromise via JTAG or UART. So this is more of a physical debugging interface on the board where you can actually walk up and plug into it. And a lot of times there's no authentication. You're right into the underlying operating system of the board, and you have direct access into the OS where you can do a lot. Wireless protocol compromise. Again, we all know the wireless 802.11, but we're also seeing other protocols there too, or other wireless. So 800 megahertz, 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz communication channels that are starting to be established. We need to do looking more there. Weak cryptography. So if you have a vendor who decides they want to write their own crypto, and we've seen that, right? They can make mistakes there and ultimately cause compromise into a system. Weak firmware management processes. This could be one where the device is calling out to an unsecure site, downloading the firmware from the internet and just applying it to the box, or you have it on a USB drive and it's not doing any type of firmware signing or CRC checking to validate that the firmware is legit. So an adversary could modify that firmware, upload it into the device, and then get remote connectivity that way. And then web interface attacks, which I discussed. So some examples, the Seagate NAS had a hard-coded root password in it. This was disclosed in 2015. But the result was that you could connect to the device via the wireless interface and get a root shell on the box. And then through the NAS, you could actually gain access to all the data that was stored on the box remotely through the wireless. The Moonworm, this was a Linksys bug that bypassed authentication in the routers, targeting port 80 and 8080. And the result was it was remote code execution on the box through, I think it was through the wireless interface. But the RCE exploit is online on ExploitDB. If you have a copy of the firmware, you can put it on a box and test it on your own. And then this was kind of a cool one. This is the integrated toilet, which is the Bluetooth-controlled toilet. And I never knew that such a thing existed, but the internet is full of really cool things, right? So Regio Satis created this toilet, and you go into your bathroom, and you can have it release pleasant scents. And it has a bidet feature that you can activate through the application on your phone, which is kind of cool. The problem is that there was a hard-coded pin for the Bluetooth that Trustwave found in 2013. And so as long as you could connect to the box, you could actually get the bidet to activate and do other things. But a lot of people said Bluetooth is not a worry. It's a short-range protocol. Well, you can actually really reach out. So this was kind of interesting, Bluetooth attack on a toilet. BlackEnergy, and I don't know if you guys have heard about this. This was a piece of malware that actually hit the Ukraine that left 225,000 people or more in the dark for some time. The malware actually targeted 2 of the Windows executables. And at the end of the day, the boxes that controlled the substations were wiped and rebooted, and the Ukrainian power company had to go out manually and turn the power back on within the substations, and it took some time to get everything back up and running as a result. So there's a lot of risks there, right? I mean, and this is just tip of the iceberg. There's tons more. And I think just from what we're seeing in these hardware attack vectors increasing, there is a justification to do more of this work, right? Bad guys are going to continue to look at these embedded devices. They're going to try to identify vulnerabilities. And so a simple risk assessment's not going to do it for us. We need to dig in further. And so I'm a process guy. So I think we need to really think about how we're going to do this and standardize our testing process. It can be measurable and repeatable at that point, so we understand what testing should be performed. And again, this is a minimum, right? We can add more as we go. But I think based on that, we're looking at the hardware reverse engineering standard, right? So I looked at the PTES, the Penetration Testing Execution Standard, and I felt like this was a great baseline for testing, but it could also be applied in hardware. And I'll walk you through that in a second. This has all been open source. It's all online. All the data is there, and I'm putting more online, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the goal of this was to make it a complement of the PTES, right? To not be in direct competition, but have the focus be on embedded systems and reverse engineering of embedded systems. How do we do this, and how do we execute? And so if you look at the HRES and how it's mapping to the PTES, the high-level sections map directly, right? That process framework is the same. It's the subsections, the testing that we do there, which is different, right? And so at a high level, this is the process outline. This is from the website. Pre-engagement, intel gathering, vulnerability analysis, threat modeling, exploitation, post-exploitation, and everyone's favorite, reporting. And I'm not going to read all the steps through to you guys just for time's sake, but I'm going to walk through this here in a second with a sample device that I did, and you guys can see the process kind of flow. So when we do any of this testing, especially in hardware and with AEP, within our culture, we want to stress security and safety. And so phase 0 should always be make sure you're safe. Make sure you're working in properly grounded systems. You understand what you're doing, how much power is going through the device. If you don't understand, ask someone, right? Don't reach in and grab something that can hurt you, right? Be careful. So again, phase 1, the pre-engagement interactions. This is where we're going to start trying to understand exactly what we want to do during the engagement. Getting a scope, talking to the customer and understanding what it is they want us to test, how deep they want us to go. When we ask or start setting up our engagement, we want to ask for some devices to test too. So we're going to ask for at least two. One that we can pull the hood apart on, take the top off, take it apart, possibly solder to the boards, and one to have where we can sit and just do passive analysis, right? But one of the devices, we're going to break the warranty on it for sure. We're going to develop our testing goals. So when we think of testing goals, that could just be to reverse engineer the firmware and try to identify vulnerabilities, or we may want to see how secure the component is to physical compromise, okay? So after we've gotten our testing goals set up, then we start looking at like setting up our test lab or workbench area. So we're going to start staging our tools. If there's custom images we have to have set up, if we need to do virtualization of some of the real-time operating systems, we're going to want to set those up as well. And then something that I've learned through trial and error is some of these vendors have custom debugging and programming tools that we need to request. So we need to build that in on the front end of the assessment to make sure we can get those. If the vendor starts giving you problems and hassle about providing those tools, well, they need to provide them so we can analyze their systems if they want us to buy them. That's my opinion. And then finally, identify if there's any anti-tamper mechanisms in the boxes as well. Sometimes the vendors are putting anti-tamper in the boxes, whether it's an alarm, glitch switch, all the way up to if you tamper with the flash module, it can actually wipe the memory on or write the contents of memory. So understanding that before we do the engagement so that we can plan for that. If we need one box separately just to do anti-tamper testing on, one to break the warranty, and then one to do our passive testing on. We just need to build that in the front end. So our intel gathering phase, again, this is where we're going to look at gathering our spec sheets, understanding what we need to connect to, if it's UART or JTAG. And there's a lot of sites online available that you can leverage to pull data. The FCC website is one. If you go to the FCC website, and I'll show you this here in a second, you can actually put the FCC vendor code in and do searches, and that site will actually show you schematics and pictures of what the board looks like on the inside of the device. And FCC is really good about publishing that data and making it available. Another one is the US Patents website. So you can go to the US Patents website, and actually if the vendor has custom patents for some type of technology or protocol they've developed, that will all be published online as well, and it's a great source of information for a reverse engineer. So then we start our vulnerability assessment phase. This is where we're going to do our soldering. We're going to extract the flash from any SOIC modules or anything on the board. We're going to test our access level and availability of JTAG and UART. We're going to monitor the bus using a logic analyzer to see exactly what we can see flowing across the data bus. We're going to record wireless data, wireless communications, using something like the HackRF or some kind of SDR if we need to. We'll map our network services, and again, that could be anything from just running Nmap on the box to once you get the firmware downloaded and extracted, you can actually see what services start at runtime in the firmware. And then again, dumping data from the flash. So we'll threat model, and this is pretty straightforward, right? We're going to look at the inputs, the outputs, identify what those are. We'll try to figure out what we think our threat actors are that would want to target this box, what the risk of that is, and build our model. Carver risk models are good too for prioritization. If you have a lot of work you need to do and you've got a short period of time for an assessment, say 5 days or something like that, you can prioritize where you need to start first, where you think the most pay dirt's going to be, and go with that. So because I'm just as guilty, I'll chase the shiny all day long, and I'll talk about that in my slides because I chased the shiny way too long in one area and got behind. So Carver risk tables, criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, and recognizability. Generally, you can rank this from 1 to 10, and there's a really good website online that breaks this down on how to use Carvers for your prioritization and your testing. And managers love this type of stuff when they say, hey, what are you working on? And you could say, well, I've got 5 things, and I risk prioritized all my work, and here's my Carver that shows what I did. They usually like, okay, you're good. They'll leave you, hopefully they'll leave you alone. And then exploitation. Again, this is everything from getting shells on the box to just trying to find out and recover passwords maybe that were on the system to get us more access into the box. You can also use some creative exploit methods here. Social engineering is an example to try to demonstrate insider threat. And then an example of some cool tools that are out there. This is the Terminator framework that's used to test AMI meters. So this framework was built specifically so that you could test smart meters and see if you could extract contents from the memory. It's very similar to Metasploit, and the fact that it has the same interface, but you can pull up the exploits and the tools inside of that, use a coupler to connect to the meter, and actually communicate with the meter and get data out. And this is documented on the website along with some other tools, like I think RouterSploit is one of them for Soho routers. And then post-exploitation. So this is where we start thinking about data exfiltration. How can we use what we're finding in the box to go into other systems? Lateral movement on the infrastructure, persistence, rights escalation, and device destruction if possible. So again, making it harder for an adversary to actually break these critical infrastructure devices. And then everyone's favorite, the testing report. So as we're doing this testing, if there is something that we find that's considered a zero-day or unknown threat, we do need to contact the vendor and do ethical disclosure to them and give them time to patch those. Just don't dump them to the internet. If you have an ethical disclosure process within your company, you should follow that. When you're developing a report, again, include that executive summary, and I'll show you that here in a second. Very high level, just so senior managers can understand what value you're providing, where the risks are, and they can make a decision if they want to buy that device for the network or wherever they're plugging it in. And then a technical report that will probably be provided to the vendor of the hardware and any technical teams internally that they can review as well. And then part of the vulnerability modeling phase is I like to use a DREAD. DREAD models can help you get a really accurate score of a risk, and it's not just the testers. This is my gut feeling on this. It's more of a mathematical equation. And so when you look at it, damage potential, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability, you can rank those from 1 to 10, put it in a spreadsheet, and then include that in your report as well. Managers, again, like to see that, and it's not just a gut feeling at that time. And it's really good for helping you visualize, well, is this risk really as critical as I thought it was, or do I need to go back and rethink? So for the demonstration, what I wanted to do was walk through. I have a UBI router, DW3611, and what's in the box? So how I got this, and you'll see the image in a second, but I like to go to thrift stores and buy devices that have Ethernet interfaces, wireless, and so I can get them really cheap there, a couple bucks, and if you let the smoke out, it's no big deal because there's going to be more coming in. Another really nice feature too is that these things were running at some point. So there's going to be log files, configuration files, SSH keys, things that you're going to get from a vendor or from somebody who was providing this device that's going to be in the memory, right? So as we're REing these devices, we want them set up and running so we can see what's happening in the box. So it's a great place to get cheap targets to rip apart. So for this one, and this is just theoretical, manager comes to me and says, hey, we're thinking about buying this DDW3611 wireless router. It's a Time Warner business class router, and we need you to test it and evaluate the security on it. So it was a 5-day assessment of this device. My goals for it was I wanted to gain elevated rights on the platform, find any undocumented features that the router may have that could be abused by an adversary, find a way to maintain remote persistence on the device, identify any potential exploits within the target platform, extract the firmware from the device and reverse engineer that, and then review any configurations that a third party may have set up on the box, right? So we want to look at third party risk too, in case the third party gets compromised and they're used as a avenue of communication into the business. So for this engagement, Google became my friend, just kind of doing some Google searches. With this device, the vendor did not post the firmware online at all. So the only way you could get the firmware was to contact Time Warner and say, hey, I need my device reflashed. They would then send somebody out, or you'd have to bring the device in. They would reflash that firmware on there for you. So the only way I was getting the firmware was to extract it from the flash chip that's on the device. So again, I was saying, how do I get my targets? This is my workbench at home and all of the different devices that I've picked up at the thrift store. there is a box there that was a credit card processing machine that someone turned into the thrift store. And I was going to talk on that, but I decided not to after I got into a little bit and started to find some things. So I took the easy way around on this one. But again, all of that gear that's sitting there was $20 for all those boxes, so super cheap. So for my pre-engagement lab setup, this is the tools I used for this engagement: multimeter, a screwdriver with multiple bits. I had the connectors I used there to connect into the flash chip. I had a Soleil logic analyzer. That's a 16-channel logic analyzer. You can get the 4-channel too, and it's just as nice. I have a bus pirate. That's a version 3.6 of the bus pirate. There's a serial connector there, Ethernet cable, micro USB, and just a couple of female-to-female connector ends. So as I started going through my intelligence gathering phase, first thing I did was took pictures of the box, top, bottom, front, back, everything, before I started taking it apart. So I'd have pictures for the report before I started breaking stuff in case I had to crack the case or something. But the highlights there was that on the bottom of the box, the Wi-Fi, the FCC ID was printed. And so the way you read that is the first 3 letters, the XCN is the actual vendor ID. And then the numbers after that is the specific appliance ID. So I noted on here too that there was no anti-tamper, so the screws were just normal screws. So if you had physical access to the box, you could take it apart in about 30 seconds with just a screwdriver. Piece of cake. Front of the device had 4 Ethernet interfaces, a USB, and then the coax interface. So this has a built-in cable modem on the device that just connects right in to the cable company. So as I cracked the case and started looking inside, that's the top of the motherboard. I noticed at on the top left of the frame there that there is a 5-pin header. That's probably some type of debugging interface, but other than that, I don't have a whole lot of details on that. And there's kind of more of a close-up on that header, and this was probably the first thing that caught my attention when I opened the box was this header, so I went right for it because I had a feeling this was probably some type of UART connection. So when I went out to the FCC's website and did a search, I did a search on the XCN and then the grantee code, which was the C21044001, and I got back like 4 results, but I wanted to actually open it up. So you can do a search on this website and just put in the XCN ID, and it will pull back everything within the FCC's database for this vendor. So in this case, when I did that search, I got 69 different results and documents. And so I was able to actually read more about the wireless card within the device and understand how the protocol and the chipset works within the wireless on the router. So it was a treasure trove of data. And again, there's the 3 results coming back just for the specific router itself. When I went out to the U.S. patent site and did a search, I didn't find anything really relevant, but I wanted to put the slide in so you guys could see that this place is a treasure trove of data if you need it for your reversing projects. So the flash chip on the board itself was on the bottom of the board, and I didn't take a picture of the whole board, so I apologize. I just wanted to focus on the chip. So from the chip itself, we can see that printed ID on the front of the chip. This is what you're going to want to Google, that MXIC and then that number, the MX25L6406EMI. When you do a Google search on that and actually just look for the PDF, the result is you're going to get back the data sheet on that chip, which is a 16-pin SOP chip, which is a flash chip. And inside of that file is the actual pinouts we need so that when we hook the bus pirate up, we actually know which pins that we need to connect to so we can communicate. For this one, I did not want to try to extract the flash from the device while it was running. I tried, and I believe that there was a debug function within the flash chip that was preventing me from reading it while it was running. So I had to actually provide my own 3.3 volts to the chip while it was powered off, which is a safer option. And when I did that, I was actually able to dump the flash from the chip with no problem. So part of the intelligence gathering phase is using a multimeter and discovering the pinout on a chip. And so the way you do that is, one, you can set the multimeter to do a continuity test, and then you can identify the ground pins by placing the black test pin on grounded metal, and then place the red pin on each pin. And as the multimeter alarms, that means that that is a ground pin. you've got the complete circuit. So this interface itself had 2 ground pins. So it narrowed it down quite a bit for me that I was dealing with 3 pins, and I was probably looking at a UART connection. So to make things a little bit easier on yourself, if you have a logic analyzer, you can plug a logic analyzer into the device. Since I knew the 2 ground pins, I didn't bother connecting into those. I just wanted to monitor the actual booting of the device and see what was happening on the pins that I was interested in. So as I set up my Soleil, I monitored, and pin channel 2, or channel 1, excuse me, it would have been pin 2 on the device, was actually sending data signals. So this is definitely a receive channel for the UART connection. So I had the ground, I had the receive, I just needed the transmit, and so I could just roll the dice at that point and narrow it down. So I know my UART is there. I started my threat modeling process at this point, and I'm looking at a modem, an Ethernet connection, the wireless, the UART, the USB, and the flash. So for me, I wanted to focus on the flash, the UART, and the modem. Those were the 3 things I wanted to focus on for my testing. The modem, because the third-party risk, somebody getting owned and then using that device to pivot in. The UART, because of physical access. I didn't know where these boxes were going to sit for my assessment. And then, again, the flash, being able to have somebody dump the flash from it and do nasty things. So connecting in with the bus pirate, power it off, dump the flash. This is version 3.6 of the bus pirate that I'm using. And then once I connect in, the bus pirate actually sees it, and it takes about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And I could have used the Shicker here, but I just used the bus pirate to give them some love. 15 minutes or so, I had the firmware downloaded on my box, and so I was ready to start trying to reverse engineer the firmware. So I'm really happy at this point. I'm like, wow, I got the firmware, everything's chugging along, I'm doing really good. And then I Ben walked, and boom, I ran into a wall. Ben walk hates me, right? This can be a very frustrating tool to run. I ran Ben walk, and I could not get the LZMA files properly extracted. They were being very mean. They were corrupted. And so I spent a lot of time trying to get this problem figured out. And so I don't know how many times I rage quit on this project and walked away and just was like, I'm going to suck it at the con. I'm just done. Drink beer and listen to metal. I don't care anymore. And so, finally, my friend, Brad, provided me some links online to help me out and threw me a bone. And after reading multiple white papers, I finally got the firmware to extract where I could actually see what was in the firmware and review it. And as I did, I started going through and looking at the configuration files, this is one of the configuration files in the firmware, and I noted that it actually, when this box starts, it starts with 2 IP addresses listening for a web management interface. There's a 192.168.0.1 and then a 192.168.100.1. And so when I connected, I was like, why is this doing this? I'm reading this wrong, right? I'd already had my rage quit moment by about 10 times, and so I'm like, I'm doing something wrong. But when I connected into the 100.1, sure enough, it was there. But it's only showing the DHCP scope as 192.168.0 subnet. So this interface is actually sitting there listening even after you change the default IP address. So it's like a phantom interface that you can connect to. So if you know it's there, you can abuse it, right? And this was kind of a weird one. And I'm still trying to figure out why this is doing this, but I took this as a way for me to maintain persistence on the box and not anybody know. So when I was looking at the third-party network, I was really curious from the DSLAM back to the ACS server and how the management company was going to push firmware updates to these boxes through that connection. And so I did a lot of research on how DocSys works and DocSys modems. And so when I pulled the configuration file from the firmware, lo and behold, I see that there's an ACS server sitting there, and it's an unencrypted connection on the provider's network, and the username and password are the same, right? So the only security from this connection is the username that's in the flash. Everything else is using the same Broadcom password, and that's all flying in the clear. So according to the DocSys standard, there should be an SSL connection being set up here. The vendor did not set it up on their internal network, and they're also using TFTP to pass the configuration files back and forth. And we can see the config file is com.bin, and I know the name of the file now. I know that they're using a TFTP server, and I've got their IP address internally of their TFTP server. So I can now go back to the vendor and be like, yeah, this is not really the best way to manage this device for our organization. We have actual data now that we can push back and say, we want you to change the password, use unique passwords for our management of the device, etc. So as I got onto the box and I went after the UART connection, I was able to note that as I booted, I could actually see the boot process. Cool. So I was able to monitor the boot process and see the bootloader, and again grab the ecram_tto.bin file. So now I know I can see the bootloader. I can interact with the bootloader. What the holy hell is that? Oh, are you serious? Fuck. How long has that been sitting? Like 30 seconds. Oh my God. That's terribad. Oh. Please don't make me drink that Colt 45 right now because I don't want to throw up. I'll drink it, but just give me a second, okay? Oh my God. That's good, man. Yeah. Where was I? Yeah, UART. So, I was able through the UART to monitor the boot process of the device. Oh man. So as a result of the monitoring and so now I lost my train of thought. That is horrible. Using Screen to connect into the box, you can actually save the boot log through Screen, and you can export that. And so as you save that configuration file, you can do an offline review after the device is booted. You can see what's going on. And later in the slides, I'll show you why that mattered for me on this one. So as I got into the firmware, though, I also noted that I wanted access to the admin interface for the website. And then lo and behold, there was the HTTP ID and the HTTP admin password that's used to configure the web interface. So I was able to pull those out and actually gain access into the admin interface of the page that supposedly only the vendor was able to have access into. And so one of the things through the UART connection I was able to do, though, was I was able to control the boot process. And so when the device booted, it actually asked you which version, which image of the firmware do you want to boot. There were two images, and then there was like a unique menu called P. It was just listed P, and I'm like, okay, what's P? Well, I go down into the P menu, and it gets me down into this really low debugging interface within the device that I can actually change the IP address of the board, change the gateway. I can set a new MAC address on the board if I want to, and then I can start interacting with memory. And so this is where I chase the shiny, and I spend a lot of time here because I can actually read from memory and write to memory. So if I know specific segments of memory that I want to write to, if I have some code that I want to inject into memory, I can use this interface to inject code. And so I had some basic shell code for ARM, And I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to write my shellcode into a memory space, and I was able to actually see the memory of what was available, so I knew where I could write into. The board was giving me all the details I needed, so as I was writing my shellcode in, I just couldn't get it to call and execute properly. So I spent a lot of time trying to chase this down, but I think from these three areas, read, write, and then jump to memory, you could actually do shellcode injection from this and get a remote shell off the box that way. So thank you very much to whoever the firmware vendor was for giving me that capability. And then another thing I was able to do was, once I got the firmware completely extracted, was I found the SSL key that is being used on the device for website encryption. So if they enabled SSL now at this point, I can still do man-in-the-middle monitoring, and then I can decrypt all of their traffic because I have the private key that's being used to set up the SSL connection. So thank you very much. So lateral movement, one of the things I did too was I set up a pseudo fake PPP connection with username. You can see the username and password. And then I created an L2TP passphrase in there as well. All of this was stored in the clear in the box, so there was no hashing or protection of credentials. So if this device was being used to terminate some type of point-to-point communication channel, once you have access to the firmware, you can extract that content from the firmware and then set up your own connection and using the creds that were set up in the device. So finally, it's report time, and everybody hates reports. Yeah, I know. So part of the findings I like to do is I like to start off with positive findings, right? So I like to say, hey, you guys did something right. So in this case, the device actually does execute our CRC check on the firmware before it loads. So as I was trying to mod the firmware and get it to load back into the device, they were checking the CRC, so I was having to modify those hash values, which was kind of painful and time-consuming. But that was something they did right, but it's not impossible to get around. It just takes a little bit of time because you have to go through the process of changing all of the hashes. The device also supports SSH and SSL out of the box. However, the device was not using SSL for the admin interface, so it was kind of like you did something good, but you did something dumb as well. So my findings for this one, it had three critical listed here. The device does have a UART header still attached to the physical board. So the vendor could have removed that header to make it harder for someone to actually do a physical compromise. Someone would have to have actually soldered a header on or put a temporary header in place. The next one was that the attacker controls the boot process when they have physical access. And as a result, we can get into that lower debugging menu to do nasty things. And then all of the creds, including the wireless and VPN creds, are stored unhashed on the box. So any type of connectivity into your infrastructure, you're going to compromise. The two highs I had were the DocSys connections, insecure protocols being used to support the box through the third party. And that since the vendor did not follow at that time any of the DocSys security recommendations. I had a medium finding there was that weird web interface. I didn't rate it as a high just because I didn't have enough time to dig into it, but I thought it was kind of curious that it was listening on two separate IP addresses. And then I had some informationals there that I didn't have enough time to dig further into, but it was worth noting in the report that that's something that being able to inject shellcode into memory through the UART connection, that's something I'm going to be spending more time on and trying to get exploitation, and then controlling the boot process. So the report out phase for an executive level, just doing something like this, your template, Brad. Having all of the high-level findings there and risk ranking them with an aggregate risk score, so we can provide that back to the executives and management so they can see what we've done. They like the one-page slides with the bar charts, right? So we provide that to them in our executive overview. The report detail is our DREAD calculation, so we can actually go into more detail here of how we got to that value. So I just put two in here as an example, the UART header and the credentials stored in clear text in the box. Both of those landed as crits for this assessment. And so as a wrap-up, and just kind of finishing up now, so I walked through this process of how we can do hardware reverse engineering and make it measurable and repeatable. That was my goal, was to define this process and make it available for the community. I think this is a standalone process. It's a branch of the PTES, as a supporting branch, I should say. But our focus is tearing apart hardware, testing hardware, identifying those software and hardware vulnerabilities, and then those can actually, if we find something good, can actually feed into our bigger pen testing. So I'm hoping that I can get some good feedback, whether it's negative or positive from the community. I'm putting it out there because I want to make this better. And so at this point, the HRE-Standard.org is online. I am still putting content online because I am a team of one. I am a team of one, but it's available. I'm putting how-to guides on there as well. So some of the things you've seen me do, like testing the pinouts using a multimeter, to using Benwalk, to how to use SHRES or a bus pirate to extract firmware. All of that is online, and I'm going to be putting more data and details online for the community to use as a whole. So that's my talk. I'm going to open it up to questions real quick. Wow, there are a lot of questions. Yes, sir. So there was a website that was telling me that the LZMA file format, sometimes when Benwalk extracts that, it gets the memory addresses corrupted, and you have to go into the header, manually change the header to make the file header to say, hey, this file is actually a lot bigger, because it was cutting off near the end of the file. For whatever reason, it's not reading the whole thing. So I went in and told the firmware, hey, it's actually bigger at the header, and then went back and reran Benwalk again, and it did another extraction. And then at that point, the person's website, he had a Python script that I was able to go in, and it just said, put in the right offsets. So I changed the offsets back, and when I did that, it actually extracted the file system for me and gave it to me. So it was painful. I had a lot of reading, and that's like the 30-second summary of it. Right on, man. For Dread, it's just, I've used it for a while and I like it. You can use whatever risk modeling, threat modeling tool you want to use. It's just something for me. I just like the write-up on it. It's been around the DoD for a long time, and so that was, I guess, just the reason. It just seemed like a more mature modeling process from risk, but that's just my opinion. Can be. We'll get to it. We'll get to it. Any other questions? Comments? Concerns? All right. Thanks, guys, for your time. Thank you.